Where is God in the midst of suffering? How can there be one truth amongst so many different beliefs, people, and religions? How are science and faith compatible with one another? These are things that not just skeptics wrestle with, but we all struggle to try to figure out what it is that we believe. I've got questions. You've got questions. We're going to go on this journey not alone, but with some of the great thinkers of our time, and we're going to try to learn from them and from one another the great mystery that is our faith.
As we continue in a series where we're talking about the big questions of faith, we come to a question that seems to loom above them all. It's a question that is not academic, it's personal. I remember when I was a brand new pastor and I received a desperate phone call. There was a young adult that had been entrusted to the church and under my care. He was recently married. They had just bought their first house. It was a stormy morning and his wife had just walked outside to go to grab the newspaper. She didn't come back in, and he couldn't figure out why. It turns out that while going to get the newspaper, she had been struck by lightning. Everything that he had pictured for his future was now radically changed in a moment, in a flash. And as he wept eventually in my office, all that he could ask over and over again was why? Where was God in the midst of this? We're going to talk about the question of suffering. And it's not just an intellectual discovery. It's a real question, born by real experience. And we're not going to get so much an answer to a puzzle as we're about to discover that there is one who will be with us in the midst of our pain. There's a lot of questions that are on our minds, whether we're a believer and go to church or whether we don't want anything to do with church. But one of the questions that comes up most frequently is, where is God in the midst of suffering? When you're asked a question about that, how do you respond to that?
Well, to be human is to suffer. You can't get through life without suffering at some point in life. There's this big question, if God is all-powerful, right, and God is good, why does he allow suffering? So this is a question which is always asked in one form or another during the course. Now, on Alpha, we don't just give answers, but these discussions takes place. And of course, if someone is suffering, the last thing they want is a pat answer about suffering. They need an arm around them.
I think it's right for us to start with some real life experiences. I think just as one example, a dear friend of mine a couple of years ago, I'd gone for a long walk with her on Thursday, and it was a lovely conversation because she'd walked through a hard season the previous few years, and everything in her life was now going great. And I came home from this conversation, I said to my husband, it's so lovely to see our friend just so happy. And then that Sunday morning, I got a message from our pastor saying that she had been attacked walking home. She was on the phone to her boyfriend at the time. She'd been randomly attacked by someone who'd taken her bag and beaten her head so badly that she'd basically lost one of her eyes, and it was unclear if she was going to have brain damage. I went to the hospital to see my friend, and I met with her dad, who had read my book. And he said, I'm so glad you're here, because when my daughter wakes up, you'll be able to explain to her that God was really protecting her in this situation, because it was so lucky that somebody came along and happened to find her. It was very late at night. It may not have happened that she couldn't, got an ambulance. There are so many ways in which God was protecting her. And I thought, I can't tell my friend that, because God could have had this kid not attack her in the first place.
I mean, I remember one time when I was Bishop of Durham, and early on a Sunday morning I got the phone call that the 19-year-old son of one of our clergy couples had died quite suddenly and unexpectedly. It wasn't an accident, some unexpected illness had overtaken him. And I checked the diary, and I was able to pass on to somebody else my duties for that morning, and I just went and I spent that morning with that couple, and we just sat in their living room and wept together. And I think at some point we made some coffee, but we just wept and we prayed and we wept some more and we looked at photographs and we did all that stuff. And I think I probably read maybe either 23rd Psalm or a bit of John or something. And they were lovely people, very fine pastors, both of them, the husband and the wife. And that was all we needed to do at that moment. And certainly not the time to say, now we've got this theory about how this all works. That's the last thing we need in that situation. But I would say that just as Jesus wept at the tomb of Lazarus, and that in a sense is one of the most profound moments in John's gospel, so as a pastor to weep with those who weep is one of the greatest theological statements that you can do. And if somebody wants to add the footnotes later, that'll be fine too.
I think all of us, especially those of us who are not presently enduring significant suffering, need to sit with that kind of reality so that one day when we are, we won't turn around and say to the Lord, well, you always promised me something different from this.
The great teachers of the church knew all about suffering and pain. They lived in a world where life expectancy was often, 30s or 40s at most, and where probably the majority of babies born didn't make it past the age of 2, and where they knew about earthquakes, they knew about famines, etc. We don't find in any of those teachers the sense that this is a terrible objection which might pull the house down on top of our Christian heads. And it's really only in the 17th and 18th century that it comes through. And I think that's because there was a move in Western culture towards what we call deism, which is the idea of God as the sort of rather distant, detached CEO who nevertheless is still sort of responsible for what's going on. And then if we don't like what's going on, we blame the CEO. And that's quite a modern idea. When we read the Gospels and the story of Jesus, we discover not a distant God sailing through the world, putting things right, telling people off, whatever, but a God who's getting his feet dirty and ultimately getting his hands pierced in order to be there and share the pain of the world. And the New Testament is quite clear. It isn't that we know about God and then add Jesus in. We look at Jesus in order to find out who God is and what God is like. And so when we look at Jesus, and especially the crucified Jesus, we see a God who is determinedly not remaining remote and is not simply pulling the strings of a puppet show from a distance, but is actually right there in the mix, sharing and bearing the pain, and then extraordinarily somehow exhausting the real force of evil, because in the resurrection he is launching the new creation in which everything is to be put right.
One of the questions that are being pressed in the modern world is, how do I make sense of being a Christian when I become really aware of the complicity of the church in so much evil? It's the problem of evil in an ecclesial context. How can I believe in God when the church has done so much evil? Well, here's the amazing thing about being a Black Christian. We never believe the propaganda. From the moment that we heard the name of Jesus, we have to wrestle with the problem of the church's complicity in slavery. And so theodicy isn't something that we put at the end of our theological reflections after we've done all of the rest of our work. Theodicy is where it begins. And so we understand, as the stepped-on peoples of the world, what it means to trust God in that context. And what we want to say is, how can you believe in a God when all of these things are happening? We want to say that the tomb is empty. And that when I look at my suffering, I make sense of my suffering through the cross, not through some philosophical explanation. I don't know if you've ever gotten in trouble, like with your spouse. I have before.
Every day.
Okay. So you can have...
It's only a matter of degrees.
Yeah,
of
degrees,
trouble.
right. So you can have an explanation, a logical explanation for what you did. But at a certain point, you need to just say, I love you. Right? There is an emotive, not an absence of, but alongside the intellectual that makes answers compelling. And so I want to say to people, as a genuine claim, if the Bible had a series of syllogisms written in the middle of it that explain to you the problem of evil, you can have the people who can do these things, right? They can kind of say, because there's evil, you have to have a sense of right and wrong points to God. They can do all of that stuff. And that could be in the Bible. It could be a unbreakable, undefeatable syllogism in between Matthew and Mark, right? It wouldn't satisfy us.
He didn't come to give us an answer.
It wouldn't. Yeah. Like I don't like this. It would be something that's missing. So what does God do? God does what the human condition demands. He comes alongside of us into our suffering.
The God of our imaginings would never intend for those who love to suffer. But the God we meet in the Bible intends it a whole lot. And in particular, in the person of Jesus, we see the human being who, of all people, God loves. The Son, the beloved Son, with whom he is well pleased. And he intends for Jesus to be brutally beaten, to be spat on, to be abandoned by his friends, to be nailed on a cross, to be experiencing the most horrific suffering that's beyond what you or I could even fathom. And then intended to raise him from the dead. So I think any Christian response to suffering must begin with the cross and end with the resurrection. For me, that is most exquisitely unpacked by Jesus himself in how he relates to Mary and Martha when their brother Lazarus dies, and when he intentionally doesn't come, lets Lazarus die, and then meets with Martha and says to her that he is the resurrection and the life. And then weeps with the sisters and then raises Lazarus from the dead. I think in that chapter of John chapter 11, we have a whole, to use a sort of technical term, theodicy, a whole picture of how God relates to us in suffering. And I think we have a holding together there of God's complete sovereignty over us. Jesus' power in that situation is unmistakable throughout that chapter. But how rather than just immediately going and healing Lazarus or giving the word from a distance, we've seen him do that in the Gospels before, just say the word, Lazarus is healed. No, he lets Lazarus die. He goes, he meets with the mourning sisters, he weeps with them, and then he raises Lazarus from the dead.
The cross is the thing that allows me to trust God. And it helps me make sense of a world that disappoints me relentlessly.
I think a very good answer is given by C.S. Lewis. He wrote a book called A Grief Observed, and really it's a record of his own reactions to the death of his wife from cancer. And Lewis talks about his own wrestling with suffering and how devastating this was. And then a moment of transition takes place where he begins to think, just a moment, Christ died on the cross. He suffered. He knows what suffering is like. It's not an abstract idea, it's a reality. Christ is the one who suffered in order that through that suffering I might have salvation and hope. And therefore, as I journey through this life, suffering with others who suffer, I am joined by Christ who also suffered, who will bring us to this safe place at the end of all of this. So Christianity is talking to us about a God who is present in suffering, who knows what suffering is, and who journeys with us as we travel through the suffering world.
God gave us the freedom to love, but with the freedom to love comes the freedom not to love. Yeah. And if people don't love, then people get hurt. So part of God allowing us free will made suffering inevitable in this world. And so much of suffering is caused by the fact that we don't love each other as we should. That's why people get killed, theft takes place, adultery takes place, relationships break up. All this is a result of God giving us free will. God uses suffering. Certainly I'd say in my own life, the times when I've grown most is through the painful times. And often he uses it to bring people to faith. Many people who come on after say, my life was going along like this, and then this happened, and as a result of this, I'm really asking questions. So God uses suffering for good. Another perspective is that we have to see it in the light of eternity, because actually this life is not the end. It's like this is
not all there is.
There's the whole of eternity. As one young guy who's been in hospital for numerous operations, and he said, how can you still believe in a good God? He said, well, God's got all eternity to put it right.
It's something I've been reflecting on recently because of one of my master's students in St. Andrews who's working on the tradition of lament in the Hebrew Scriptures, and working on the fact that God gives his people, in the Psalms particularly, the great gift of lament, not in order that God may be upstairs and his people downstairs are lamenting because everything's going bad, but in order that God, in the midst of his people, may share that sense of grief, which you get in Genesis 6. God looks at the mess in the world and it grieves him to his heart. And so I take that across to one of my favorite chapters, Romans 8, where Paul talks about the Spirit groaning within us as we groan, as we share the pain of the world. In other words, when you do this theology thing in Trinitarian mode rather than in deistic mode, the problem in a sense doesn't go away, but it's suddenly got three dimensions, and it's all about God's own lament from within the heart of the world. Most Westerners to this day find that very difficult to think of about God, because that's not how God is conceived in the Western world. But I think that's how God is conceived in Scripture. And the idea of God sharing and bearing the pain of the world in order that the world may be healed, I think it's pretty central to what Christianity is all about.
We began our question today by telling you a tragic's tale. It's a story also of how God works in the midst of suffering. That through even the pain and the loss, that God was there not only giving consolation to the desolation of his life, but also beginning the process of restoration and seeing what is possible even through the worst that we could possibly imagine. Dallas Willard says, you can either let suffering determine your view of God, or you can let God determine your view of suffering. The real question behind our pain is not so much why, as much as it is how long. Over and over again in the Psalms of lament of the Bible, how long, O Lord, how long, O Lord? In other words, if we trust that God really is in the restoration business, how long must we wait until his promises are fulfilled? The promise is secure, but when will we have what we hope and long for? We get that in the presence of Jesus Christ as a foretaste right now. But there will come a day when every tear is wiped away from our eyes. And so we can lean into this question, not knowing why things happen. But we know that the one who wept over Jerusalem and the one who wept at the tomb of his friend Lazarus is also the one who weeps with us until the resurrection is to come.